For our next speaker, we have João from Protocol Labs. He leads a client growth effort at Protocol Labs. His team is responsible for accelerating the onboarding of large datasets to Filecoin and drive the adoption of decentralized storage, which I think is a great continuation to the topic that we're bringing in. And in this talk, he will provide an analysis of trends in data onboarding and also goes beyond the amount of data being onboarded and dive into the who, what, when, and how of growth at Filecoin. Let's welcome João.
Okay, so while we get the slide started, I want to caveat this by saying I've been running around like a crazy headless chicken, as the expression goes in Portuguese. I just came back from FIL Lisbon at LX Factory and was sprinting behind the Uber and then sprinted here. So I'm a little flustered, but the conversation today is going to be a little bit more about analytics in the context of client growth. A client refers to someone, an entity, individual, enterprise, or group that goes through the FIL Plus program and receives some data cap and then uses that data cap to onboard data with a storage provider. So when I say a client, it could be a on-ramp like Web3.storage or Estuary that has gone through the application process to receive data cap, but it could also be just a single large entity that is onboarding a bunch of content. Yeah, so it's a stand-up now. No, I'm just kidding. I can talk about it without slides. So the main thing that I was going to talk about really is using some supporting material that is not here, chart our path to our goal of a significant amount of data onboarded every single day. We are at 285 petabytes of data onboarded so far, which is amazing, and it's growing really, really quickly, about 20 to 25% month over month. And we just spent the last week in our team setting our targets for next year, and they're super ambitious. We're shooting for 2 EB of data by the end of 2023. So right now, our daily onboarding rate is about 2.5 to 3.5, depending on the day, pebibytes per day. Assuming a fairly decent sort of like constant growth curve toward the end of next year, we need to get to 10 petabytes a day. It's a lot. And so one thing that I wanted to cover with you all today is how we in the client analytics and the client growth team look at analytics, use those insights to inform strategy. It was the very first effort that I think with focus did when I landed at PL 7 months ago or 8 months ago now, was recognizing that we can't manage what we can't measure, and so instrumenting the necessary data pipelines to figure out exactly how we are growing and what's driving that growth. It is a story of combining on and off-chain data, and it is also a story of reconciling with the fact that we just don't have sometimes very rich information that enables us to guide decision making. All right, so we have some charts, we have some data to look at. This is why we're all here. So a few months ago, we actually set a target of 5 petabytes of data onboarded a day. And right in June, when we met in New York City, we set, what does it look like for us to ramp up to that by the end of the year? And it's actually surprisingly on point. It's pretty shocking. It's rare that something you model so naively ends up being such a nice representation of reality. What I do want to point out here is what you're looking at is in blue, the total amount of data. It's equivalent to this blue line. But then crucially, the data onboarded is a function of how many people are active on a particular day, onboarding data, and how much data each of those people is onboarding on that particular day. And so what we're starting to observe is a much higher rate of onboarding, both in terms of how many people are onboarding, but how much they are onboarding on a given basis, on a given day. I also want to point out the fact that what we care about is this part in red, right? We care about very large clients, and we classify a large client as a client that has onboarded over 100 petabytes of data over their lifetime. The goal of the network growth team is to accelerate the data onboarded, and so we really have 2 options. We either get a lot of volume from a lot of people, but really shallow engagement, or much deeper engagement from a few people. And that's what we're seeing. Right now it's 15. Actually, I think it's at 16. This represents about 160 clients, I believe, total, who have onboarded over 100 terabytes, which is really significant.
Wait, is that the percentages of them as a number of clients, or as the volume?
That represents the number of clients. Yeah, yeah. And so one thing that I also want to point out, which is a result of all this great instrumentation work that we've been doing, is as we dig much more into the client ID as a dimension, it allows us to actually start tracking things and start getting some insights into where the majority of growth is actually coming from. On the top, you actually see the absolute number of daily active data onboarders, and on the bottom, that's represented as a proportion. And so what we're seeing is about 72, I believe, daily data onboarders, of which about 50% have onboarded over 100 terabytes, right? So on a given day, whereas in the previous chart we were looking at overall the universe of clients, this is a snapshot on a particular day. And so what's really interesting is the fact that we are starting to see, these large data clients really form the majority of total data onboarded. And so it starts informing our strategy toward the persona in terms of the product that we are building and whom we're catering for. This obviously fits in very well with our strategy of leveraging enterprise clients, both from a FIL Plus standpoint in terms of enabling the process that allows us to really trust those large clients, but I think more fundamentally from the tooling perspective, both in terms of the necessary tooling for the data preparation, and data transfer, but also the actual infrastructure, whether those large card files, thousands and thousands of car files when you're talking about a petabyte scale data set, are being transferred over the wire or off the wire. And so really what I want to highlight here is just how significant the total amount of people is that are actually onboarding significant size data sets. Now, I also want to point out the fact that really the main value add from some of the work we've been doing over the past few months has been combining on-chain and off-chain data. So as RG mentioned, or might have mentioned, I missed the talk, but the FIL Plus process involves a rigorous process through notaries and governance whereby someone, a client, comes in through an application on GitHub, right? And so GitHub is the only source of truth that we have today for who these people are. And so again, I landed here and I said, well, who are these clients? Who's actually driving data? And it was surprisingly challenging to actually be able to reconcile on-chain and off-chain data. We were lucky to capture a unique address, right? An address ID that we could use to join these data sets, right? So I'm basically pulling all the data from on-chain, looking at the deal proposals and active deals on a particular day, and I'm joining that against the data that I scrape from HubSpot, from GitHub that contains information like who it is, what their industry, or not the industry, but like what purpose they have with the data in terms of onboarding. And so this is a snapshot of a key piece of information that we look at on a regular basis in my team that allows us to actually dig in much deeper and actually see who is who. It's not enough to celebrate 4 petabytes a day if the information is junk or if we actually don't know who's driving this, because what we're really looking for is evidence of product market fit. We want to start noticing patterns in terms of the type of data, in terms of the industry they represent, who these clients are, what the requirements are, so that we can identify those gaps and really try to leverage the ecosystem to plug those. And so, as a concrete example, this is a snapshot as of, I believe, last Wednesday when we did hit close to 4 petabytes of data onboarded per day, and we're starting to see your typical on-ramps that you might expect today, 2 of which are very large from Slingshot, which is a program driven by the data programs team aimed at onboarding public data sets. And then over here, 3, 4, 5, 6 are examples of various companies, primarily based in Asia, as you'll see later, that are onboarding a bunch of stuff. I mean, really, it's a very wide range of things that we are observing. what's interesting is, we would expect a lot of it to just be pure archival. You're starting to see more and more people actually onboard logs and things like that, not necessarily just for pure preservation, but with the idea of eventually using those and leveraging those in ETL pipelines. And so these are interesting examples of content, whether it's online MOOC, right? So like education stuff, whether it's IoT sensor data. This particular one, they've uploaded, onboarded, just in the last week, 1.6 petabytes. These are significant amounts. And I think it's starting to paint us a much richer picture about sort of what the data is that people and clients are onboarding. This is a view from the flip side, actually. If you use the Lily data, by the way, I don't know where Forrest is, but thank you. There you go, hello. If we use the Lily data, this is all based on the Lily dumps, right? Where I'm using a query engine to just basically parse it and produce these very simple visualizations. What you're looking at here is the amount of deal proposals on a particular day. A deal proposal represents a 32 gigabyte sector between a client and a storage provider. And here we can actually, I'm mapping the miner ID to Jimpic's location data to actually get a better picture of, on a daily basis, the proportion of deals that is coming from each region. So again, this is the sort of picture that we have to start building, and as we develop a better intuition for where our growth is coming from, and so that we can start really honing our growth efforts around those patterns.
Sorry,
Yeah.
is that the location of the client?
Location of the miner. Yeah, location of the client is a really good example of something Celine will talk about, I believe, right? Where we depend on what we have on GitHub, right? And so it's really a matter of working with the governance team and with a broader community to figure out, well, this is really an exchange of, well, you're doing some KYC and in return you get some data cap, essentially. And to what extent are we okay with saying, hey, let's collect more and more data, assuming it's obviously in public because it's all there on GitHub. We have to be mindful of not over-collecting. We just don't want to fall back into the Web 2 trap. But of course, something like the location of a client would be very useful. And so those are the sorts of things that we're working on to gather. So achieving our 2023 goals, I alluded to the fact that we are targeting 10 petabytes per day, which represents, if all goes well, by the end of next year, 2 exabytes. It's a lot of data. And so the question is, well, I don't have an answer, but the question is, where is it going to come from, right? What on-ramps are going to power this? There's obviously going to be new on-ramps that maybe focus on machine learning, audio-visual stuff, right? Like really heavy data that I'm sure is going to power a lot of that. There's Slingshot. It's going to power a lot more. I think deep estimates about 1.2 petabytes per day by the end of next year, which is significant. But really, it's going to come from many different sources that we can't even imagine. I imagine there's going to be many different derivative data sets as compute over data is launched. We're going to see more and more of that sort of stuff where we have lots of videos that are being parsed and reformatted and rotated to create synthetic data sets for machine learning models that then other people can use, and then they'll create synthetic data sets on those. But for now, we really have like first order mechanisms, which are the on-ramps that we build and that the ecosystem builds, right? This is, again, a very naive projection of what that could look like, right? Starting on the left-hand side, you're looking at the total onboarded PIBs. Right now, we're about 300. So the question is, what is an appropriate growth curve for us to target 10 PIBs a day, right? And so really, this represents, if we want to get to the 10 MB goal by the end of next year, it implies a 0.5% daily growth rate, which is aggressive, especially as we get to this part of the chart where you're talking about a 0.5 increase on a massive base. But it's actually, we've been pretty much on point with that. And to give you context, this is a typical sort of like Juan Benet example, data point. But he'll say, well, at YC Combinator, what they try to target is a 1% daily growth rate. So 7% in 7 days. So that gives you an idea of the aggressiveness of the growth that they're seeking. This is half that. So I believe that, as we enter the third year of the mainnet, I think it's actually okay. It really will depend on several things, though. It will depend on us having a saturated deal funnel. Are we actually getting enough deals, interest from clients? Can we sustain the bandwidth? That's a huge question mark, really big, right? We simply don't know. At this point, just for context, right? Like if you have a saturated 100 gigabit line and you're talking about a 1 petabyte data set, it's going to take weeks. And so the question is, like, do these storage providers have the right network to sustain that amount of bandwidth in our network? And then, of course, ceiling capacity. And not most importantly, but like extremely crucial, is the fact that for all these deals are FIL Plus deals, and we don't anticipate them to not be FIL Plus deals, which means we will need about 106 million FIL of collateral for all these deals. It's also a lot, right? And it represents a significant proportion of total circulating FIL. So there's a lot of interdependencies here. We need to figure out infrastructure. We need to figure out lending protocols with the FEM. We need to figure out all these things. There's no way our team will get here on its own. And so we rely on you and the ecosystem to help us figure that out. So, my goal here really is to just seed some ideas. I love talking about this stuff. It's my favorite area. I intentionally didn't want to come in with like a grand presentation here, but I do want to ask the team and the group here, look, how we get there will involve having a much better sense of where growth is coming from, and that will be a function of having more insights around who these clients are, what on-ramps are driving growth, right? Is it Web3.storage? Is it Singularity? Is it big data exchange? There's sort of decomposition between data movers and data preparers nowadays, and so the question becomes, how do we capture that data and how do we actually see it and to actually drive insights? We need to understand region, industry, by client, etc. We need to systematically measure and dismantle these major bottlenecks around deal flow, bandwidth, and ceiling rate that I mentioned. But I think crucially what I also want to highlight is, better data obviously leads to better insights. And so we need to work as a community to make sure that we are dealing with common sources of truth that are correct, right? I know Lily has been an incredible resource for us, but I know that various participants in the ecosystem are figuring out ways of basically creating some stopgaps here and there when that particular Lotus node was not running that day. And so you have some missing data here and there. It's not crazy. It lets us directionally establish where things are headed, but we need to make sure that we focus on this space. Dimensionality is something I care about deeply. For storage providers, that's one thing that we keep talking about over and over and over again, which is a storage provider in most of as far as Lily is concerned, as far as the chain is concerned, we're looking at minor IDs, right? A storage provider entity can have multiple minor IDs. We know for a fact that some of them have 40, 50 minor IDs. And so when it comes to these storage providers, who we actually talk to is some sort of legal business entity that has many many IDs. So we have to be both careful with our semantics. When we talk about 4,000 miners, really what we're talking about is some subset of those people actually representing legal business entities that are responsible for doing the business development, the legal, commercial agreements, the onboarding, etc. But we also have to be very mindful of, I guess, answering the question, how do we get that metadata? Whilst being, privacy preserving and respecting people's, need for anonymity, right? But we need to create some sort of mechanism that is either ideally carrot-based, hopefully not stick-based, but something that allows us to collect more rich information about these storage provider entities and how they all map together with regard to these minor IDs. And finally, in terms of the availability of data, one big question that I have top of mind is, can we establish better methods for joining data on-chain and off-chain? Is GitHub, GitHub is a fine place for us to manage the entire process of LDNs, but is it, should I really be scraping GitHub for data? Probably not. We should probably have some system closer to the source where those forms are filled that sends structured data to some database. Could be HubSpot, could be whatever, I don't care. But I shouldn't be scraping and doing regular expressions on GitHub. Secondly, can we capture the relevant data on-chain in the first place? Again, I know there's been several interesting discussions about this. We don't want to bloat the chain, But if we have some, small universe of tools, for example, that we represent as a simple enum, it wouldn't be crazy, I believe, to just sort of like, capture a simple, couple bits on chain to represent what tool was used to make that deal, or perhaps what tool was used to make the deal and the data preparation. It's only by knowing the sort of relationship between all these entities in the, let's call it data supply, data onboarding value chain, that we will understand where the gaps exist and how to invest in plugging those. So that's it. I'll be around. I love these conversations. Please ask me anything you want. Do we have time for questions? Okay, cool. Yeah, well, Steph, I know you. Yeah, you had your question first.
Sorry, can you go back to the charts?
This one?
Not that one. Back.
This one?
Back. That one.
Yeah.
So when you say the red line is people who've ever uploaded like 1,000 TIBs. Is this on? Maybe.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens if you look at that? What does the contribution look like, say, in the last month from the different sizes of storage providers?
It's huge. Like,
So
I mean,
is there a point at which some of those bigger ones, they're in your data because they used to be big and they've sort of shrunk a bit?
Oh, that's a good point.
Rather than
it's in the dashboard,
Right.
And you can refer to it. By the way, I do want to say that this dashboard was something that we created internally that we do want to externalize. We're having discussions about what the best method is for externalizing all this data. Obviously, we want to collaborate with Starboard and other participants in the network to have common sources of truth. But then I would love to have an SP dedicated and client dedicated dashboard that other people can refer to that is also like rich and correct, that people could actually do the math and you get to the same exact number. That's not a lot to ask for. Yeah.
because I'm just wondering, is there any danger that their sort of historical weight is biasing what their current contribution looks like?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I mean, sure. If you're looking at just like, here's how many, like lifetime, yeah, we'd have to look at sort of running monthly total or some, 28-day moving average sort of thing and then bucket them into that, which is a good idea. Yeah, by the way, if anybody wants to contribute, you're more than welcome to contribute to our dashboards. Yes.
Thank you. I also have some question about this chart, but we can talk about it separately.
Sure.
I think I have two main comments. They may not have an easy answer. I think like one is about decentralization. I think also congrats on hitting 4 petabyte. But as we mentioned in Raghav's talk earlier, we know there might be some abuse.
Yeah.
And also like as you mentioned earlier at the end of the talk as well, there's many SIBO identities. I'm wondering so the first comments around decentralization. Whether we are doing anything to actually track that, or like there's anything we have any initiative or metrics that we're doing to make it easier for people to onboard, and how do we measure against decentralization?
Yeah.
Then the second comment is around like impact. Just a comment on like the client that we list out as top client. If I remember correctly, they have been top clients for the network since the very beginning. So like, how are we quantifying their impact to the network, and how are we getting them to drive more impact to the network?
Yeah. Really good questions. I think for the first question, hold on, I'm blanking. What was the first question?
Decentralization.
Decentralization, yes. So I think, can tackle this, first measuring some proxy of decentralization. I think a simple thing, which is something actually Steph and I have talked about, is, let's consider this chart, which is, the weekly, right? It'd be nice if we could just drill down here and see exactly how many storage providers each client is actually onboarding data with and represent, as a proportion of total. Are we seeing some sufficient regional decentralization or decentralization in terms of like the variety of SPs across whatever? In terms of decentralization from a client perspective, I think really it's a function of the guidelines for FIL Plus. I think one thing that's going to be really cool in the next year is, as we work, or for example, the data programs team establishes SPADE, this sort of deal engine, where you have codified rules and policies around whom to make deals with around the world, right? How many people and where, you're going to have a much richer, I think, structure. I don't want to say imposed because it's a sort of word that's counter to the whole decentralization ethos, but if they choose to use that deal engine, because we're not imposing that, then we will have a sort of codified natural result of things being more decentralized, because that's how the deal engine distributes deals. What was your second question?
Like impact, right? Like
Impact,
this number
yes.
is great, but
So I had a moment last week where I sort of, we were talking about, well, what is the point of all this? I mean, I'll be honest, right? Like, we are doing this, especially the public data, with the mindset that it'll eventually be useful, right? And that involves keeping track of what actually is being onboarded. What are the car files that are being onboarded? How do I find those? It's building an index. And so, we have people like Sankara in the data programs team that is exploring something like looking at a data explorer, right? Where we can actually have like a Kaggle type system where we can say, hey, you want to use Landsat? Here's how to actually get this data. I think I would not be confident in saying I personally have driven impact until I can see evidence of people actually retrieving the stuff. That's my opinion. And I think if we want to do that, we need to instrument a lot more logging around retrievals, right? We need to test not just if it is retrievable, which I know people are doing, right? Like looking at the retrievability of each deal, but I think fundamentally we need to also look at not just if is it retrievable, but is it retrieved? And so I encourage everybody here to explore that as well and join me there, because what's the point of like building a beautiful park if you don't know how many people use it, or something like that. So that's an aspect of impact that I really want to hone in on in 2023. Yeah.
great, thank you. I mean, it's a hard question, so
Yeah.
for more discussion.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks so much, João.